Hi, this is Denise from Denise in Wonderland, a magical journey of faith with Christ. This is the second podcast episode. Today, the podcast is titled The God Who Sees. We are going to be reading from Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 15. If any of you are familiar with that part of the Bible, Genesis 16 introduces us to Hagar, the slave to both Abraham and Sarah's household. And if you're also really familiar with the story, you'll know that Hagar actually bore the first child of Abraham. I titled this podcast, The God Who Sees, because there's this beautiful encounter between God and Hagar in the wilderness when she runs away. So I really want to go through this part of the Bible verse by verse and really talk about how we can learn from Hagar and what she experienced and possibly apply it to our lives today. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first verse in chapter 16 reads, Abram's wife Sarah had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarah said to Abraham, Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. What a lot of folks may not realize is that during this time period, it was just not acceptable at all for a woman to not provide children to her husband. So you just could not be married and just go without children. However, there were a lot of laws written. There was an infrastructure in place that actually helped women provide heirs to their husbands. What I mean is that a woman could actually take a slave and give the slave to her husband so that she could have a child through her, much like a surrogate. Sadly, this was not necessarily a good thing for the slave. The slave would remain a slave, and her children would be basically turned over to her mistress. So in essence, Sarah, those children would belong to Sarah. Any children that Hagar would provide would not be her own. They would be Sarah's. The slave, could become even isolated. I mean, imagine having to bear children for who owns you, and you're going to watch these kids grow up, but you're not going to be their mother. Someone else will be. And also the slave would be bound to the family as a slave. And there were repercussions if they attempted to leave. I mean, it could even spell death. So it's interesting that our first introduction to Hagar is we don't really get much information about her. We just know she's a slave and she's owned by she's owned by Sarah as well as Abram. And then, of course, we see that Sarah gives Hagar to her husband, and then she becomes pregnant. So I really want us to think about just Hagar in her point of view, because sometimes I know when I first read this, I was just thinking more so about Abraham and Sarah and how sad it is. But then it's like, well, what about this poor Hagar? She's in this household and she's just given to this man and she's got to have his child. But imagine that this is you. I mean, you are a slave. You don't really mean anything necessarily. And she's there to do the will of the folks that own her. And so we have this woman who doesn't even seem important. She's just important because she's just going to bear a child for the household. So she's just a means to an end. So really, when you think about Hagar right now, there's not really much going for her. I mean, there's not even really any hope for her because the way the laws are written, she's not going to have, even though she's going to have this child, it's not going to really mean anything for her. So let's go ahead and continue on. The next verse, when she realized that she was pregnant, she treated her mistress with contempt. Now, I can't necessarily say that I blame her. I mean, imagine, again, she's a slave and she's able to become pregnant. And remember, Sarah has been unable to bear children for her husband. And I don't know the time period on how long it took for Hagar to become pregnant, or if it happened, after a one night deal. But she becomes pregnant, and can you imagine even her mistress? She's not going to be happy with her because she's running around, carrying this baby that Sarah should be carrying. And you have to think in terms of Sarah is probably a woman in pain herself. I mean, she's unable to bear children. She feels pressured probably to figure out a way to give her husband a child. And now she's got to watch this woman grow and, get bigger as she's pregnant, and just watch that. But if you think even from Hagar's point of view, hey, again, this child is not supposed to belong to her. So, if she wants to feel a little, excited about it, she might. And who's to say, Hagar may have had a few digs here and there towards Sarah. I mean, we really don't know, but we do know that she did treat her mistress with contempt. So that probably involved a lot. But let's go ahead into verse 5. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and ever since she saw that she was pregnant, she has treated me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarah, "Here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarah mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. So we see Abram, he's just not getting in between an issue between two women. He's like, do whatever you want with her. She's your slave. You own her. Take care of it. And of course, Sarah, she does not treat her well at all. She probably treats her really bad. And so, of course, Hagar runs away. And I think that it's important to remember that Hagar is still pregnant. And we're not talking about 2017 running away, hopping in a car, going back home. We're talking about Hagar, who is a slave. We don't even know if she has any family nearby. And Hagar goes on the run, pregnant, in the wilderness. I want everyone to just kind of imagine, getting on foot. There's no streets there. I mean, we're talking about a place where anything could happen to you. But think about Hagar. She's not even thinking at this point. I mean, it had to have been really bad for her to just pick up and leave. There's no way that Hagar thought this through. She just wanted to escape. So just think about, how do you think Hagar felt? And have you ever felt like you've been in a situation where you just have to pick up and go, and you're not thinking about how you're going to make it, what's going to happen? You just know that you just don't want to do it anymore, and you've just got to go. So I really do feel sorry for Hagar here. And think about it. She matters. I mean, the fact that the Bible's got her included in here. So, think about some things, that you may have done. Yes, Hagar was not treating Sarah very well, but Sarah wasn't treating Hagar very well either. So just think about things that you may have done, or maybe someone may have done to you, where you have just now found yourself in a place where you may feel alone. You didn't figure out what you were going to do when you left, but you just were trying to escape the pain. So just think about Hagar and remember that she is still a slave, and to run away as a slave back then, again, that could have poor repercussions. This is not an employee quitting her job. This is actually serious. And then also too, you've got to remember she's carrying Abraham's child, and she's just taken off, because this child that she's carrying is not her own, according to the laws and customs of that time. So she's put herself in a really bad position. But again, I can't say that any of us should judge her. If anything, we should feel for her. But let's go ahead and go to the next portion, which I think is one of the greatest parts of this part of the Bible, starting with verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, you must go back to your mistress and submit to her mistreatment. I want us to think about verse 7. It's beautiful that the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't really believe that there was lots of springs of water hanging out in the wilderness. It's amazing that she just happens to stumble across a spring of water in the wilderness. And it's amazing that also that the angel of the Lord found her. He couldn't find her unless he was looking for her, which meant that he had his eyes on her. We're talking about Hagar, the slave who shouldn't even really be that important, but God is watching out for her. He's looking out for her. And I believe that he placed that spring just there for her, which means he knew she was going to be there and he had already provided something for her. Even though she ran away and again, like I said earlier, she wasn't even thinking about where she was going. God knew where she was going to go. And he made sure there was something waiting for her to provide what she needed and to provide her rest. I mean, again, we're talking about a pregnant woman here. We don't even know if she had anything with her. We're talking about the desert. So this is purely just divine intervention. God is there and he found her. Think about, there's been times that you may not have even noticed before where you have ended up in a place and you don't even know how you got there, but somehow, some way, something happens to just help you along the way. And just imagine that God, that's the way God works, is he knows everything. So he knows where you're going. Even though you think that you did something in some rash decision, nothing surprises him and he knows where you're going. So that's why it's beautiful when he says, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? He knows he knows the answers to those questions, but he's engaging her. He wants to have a conversation with her because he wants to say, I care about what has happened to you. I care about where you're trying to go. And he knew that she did not know where she was going because she replied, I'm running away from my mistress Sarah. She didn't know where she was going. And then he told her where she needed to go. And this can be painful because it's like, well, why would he tell her this? I mean, because God tells her, you must go back to your mistress and submit to her mistreatment. However, I love that he says mistreatment because he acknowledges that what is happening to her is not a good thing. You know, how horrible would it be? Like, oh, go back. You're just fine. Oh, they're not doing anything to you. No, he acknowledges you need to go back. But I understand that what's happening to you is not a good thing. And this may seem like a touchy thing for some folks because it's like, well, why would God tell you to go back to that? But again, you have to understand, even during this time period, and we'll address this more in the other podcast that will come after this, where we will talk about Hagar again when she's going to leave again. There's a reason why she goes back. But when she goes back, it's going to enable her to give birth and everything. Because remember, she is pregnant and she's out there in the wilderness and it's not time for her to leave yet. There's divine timing in what God plans for your life. So sometimes he's like, I want you to go. I understand this hurts. I understand this is painful for you, but you've got to return because it's not time yet. I've got something planned for you to leave, but I don't have it ready for you yet. It's not that God can do anything that he wants, but he knows when is the perfect time for you to leave, the perfect time for him to deliver you from something, because God uses everything, every circumstance for your good. He will make everything work to your own good, even mistreatment. So again, God makes her go back. So Hagar does return, but this should give a lot of people hope. I mean, this should provide you with hope and guidance, because even though most of us listening to this, most of us that are Americans, we're not familiar with what it would be like to be a slave. However, just know that, just look around you. There's so many of us who are descended from people that may have been slaves. Some of us are descended from people who have went through horrible things. But even today, we are living testaments that even though we may come from a history of brokenness, of an enslavement, we show that something different existed later on. And you have to just have that hope. Now, there are always going to be, sometimes there's situations that you have to return to, and sometimes there's situations you cannot return to at all. But God can strengthen you, and he promises to be with you. Let's go to verse 10. In verse 10, God then tells her, after he's told her to return to her mistress, he says, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. God is giving her hope. He's not sending her back empty-handed and just saying, just go there and it's just going to keep happening. He's like, no. He's like, I am going to multiply your offspring. Now remember, Hagar is a slave. This child that she's carrying is not supposed to belong to her. But God has already told her, you have offspring and I'm going to multiply them. They will be too many to count. He's like, you matter because you are going to mother a nation. He's like, you will have a son. He didn't say Sarah's going to have a son through you. He said, you will have a son and you will name him. And that's what's beautiful too, is he told her that she was going to name him. Why is Hagar, the slave, going to name the child that she is supposed to be bearing for Sarah and Abraham? Because God already knew this child is yours. I've given him to you. It's like, so don't think about what the plans other people have for your life. Think about the plans that God has for your life. Sometimes God plans things. You will see things unfold, and people will try to basically identify and say, "Hey, well, this is what's happening," but God will step in and say, "No," because it is only God's vision for your life that matters, and God had a vision for her. So he did not let her return empty-handed, and he acknowledged, I know you're in pain. I've heard your cry of affliction, and that's why I'm giving you this promise. And that was a great promise. I mean, he really expected a lot of faith out of Hagar, and Hagar did have faith. Let's go to verse 13. So she called the Lord who spoke to her, the God who sees, for she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. That is why she named the spring a well of the living one who sees me. It is located between Kadesh and Barren. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son Hagar had. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. This, again, it just gets greater and deeper the more you read into this. Again, Hagar, after God had given her that promise, that vision for her life, she says, you are the God who sees. She's like, and you see me. And she named the spring the well of the living one who sees me, because again, he provided that water. He provided her physical need, but he also provided her spiritual need by giving her that vision, giving her that hope. And that's why they call it the well of the living one who sees me. And what's so beautiful is in Hebrew, the word that is used for the well is similar to the word for eyes. So it's like if God sees you, he's going to provide for you. So if you truly believe that God is watching you, he is not going to sit there and watch you and not provide. He's going to provide, and he's going to provide in multiple ways. He will provide for whatever your physical needs are, and he will provide for your spiritual needs. Again, we can't force God's hands. I always, love to tell my husband all the time. I said, God is not a genie. He is not a genie. He will provide for you, but he provides in his time because he knows what you need and when you need it. But what's even more beautiful is he knows what you will need 10 years later. And when we go through the next podcast where we will talk about when Hagar has to leave again, you will realize why this happened. You will realize that God gave her a hope here because he needed her to have an event in her life where she would know God helped me then, so that when something happens later on, she knows exactly who to call. See, if you don't go through anything in your life, then when things happen, you're not going to know who to call. The moment that you experience something where you are left alone and you have no one, but you know that God is the only one that helped you, that God was the one you had to turn to. When something happens later, you know exactly who to call. You know exactly who to trust, even if you are in the most painful of circumstances. Just remember that God sees, and God always makes promises that he will always fulfill. He is not a man that he should lie. Remember, walk your path with God. Stay on the path. It doesn't matter what it looks like today. But remember, tomorrow he will do wonders in your life.